So our panelists are John McArthur, Katrina Kosic, and Tonya Rao. And I will introduce them one by one and pose my questions to them. And I'll begin with John. John is a senior fellow with Global Economy and Development at the Brookings Institution. And I'm saving John's 5 minutes for him as opposed to the introduction for him. John, please comment on the report's implications for food security from a global perspective, including the efforts to achieve SDG 2 by 2030. Are we on track? Are we off track? What do you see as the big challenges and opportunities going forward?
Thank you so much, and thank you to IFPRI and FAO. And I have to say, it's always intimidating to go after anyone named McGovern when talking about food security, given the history of those issues. But I would say that this report, I salute the authors, first of all. This is obviously a major effort, and it's a huge amount of research that goes into it. At the same time, I've become increasingly depressed when I read these reports, because every year it feels like I'm reading the same refrain. And I think that's the big point here. We are not seeing a bending of the curve. It's, if anything, bending the wrong way, but it's certainly not bending in the right way. And we have recently put out a little estimate of all the people-focused sustainable development goals at Brookings, a paper called "How Many People Will the World Leave Behind?" And put this out in advance of the UN General Assembly conversations. And if you just look at the SDG 2 points, so this is, if this is a snapshot in this report, we look forward out to 2030. What will the world look like in 2030 under business as usual? Some of the data might get tweaked because we put it out right before this came out. But the bottom line is, on stunting, if you think of all the people who the SDG is meant to help between 2015 and 2030, get about 44% of the way there. So that means that more than half the people will be left behind. The goal of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind, and in this instance, quite literally. These are the zero targets of elimination. And I think that forces the mind to be much more practical. If you look at wasting, we only get about 1/3 of the job done. If you look at undernourishment, only about 1/4 of the job. And as this references, if you look at something like child overweight, or a metric of obesity and the path to that, we're actually moving dramatically in the wrong direction. We increase it globally by about 25%. This is the universal challenge. It's in pretty much every country in the world. And that's why the SDGs aren't just about over there, they're equally about over here. So when I talk about, what do we really need to figure out, there are absolute numbers of people, as this report draws attention to, who are being left behind, specific people suffering from specific problems in specific places. And we can actually look at these trajectories with much more specificity than I think we've been doing. So any report that comes out on any issue globally right now, I ask the question, don't just tell me how we're doing today, and don't just extrapolate a global aggregate, because that gives you all sorts of funky results. Extrapolate how each country, and ideally each community, is doing out to 2030. And if we do that, just looking at the numbers of people, and this is, as mentioned, we have about 450 probably million people who will still be in extreme poverty, the so-called dollar a day, measured $1.90. We have about 665 million people who will be undernourished, about 104 million children who will be stunted, about 90 million children who will be overweight, and about 40 million children who will be subject to wasting. These are large numbers. They're not impossible numbers. Each of them is a percentage. The children overweight is actually about 22% of the relevant global population in 2030. It's a major number, whereas wasting is about 6%. So that gives us kind of a sense of the range we're talking about. Final thing I'll just say quickly is, if you look at how each country is doing, that tells you one set of information. If you look at where the problem is for the world, that tells you another set of information. Just to illustrate the point, on undernourishment, about 5 countries account for half the people who will be undernourished in 2030 on a business as usual case. That's India, Pakistan, China, Uganda, and Nigeria. by our estimates. So if you don't have answers for those 5 countries, or if you don't help those 5 countries come up with good answers, you don't have answers, as far as I'm concerned. On the other side, if you look at children overweight, the top 5 countries account for about 40% of the issue, and that's India, China, Nigeria, Indonesia, and the United States. So it's a global issue. Final thing I'll just say in terms of how we think about this, I would suggest that we start to think about the confidence intervals for our estimates in these reports moving forward. I worry about false precision in some of these numbers. I worry about decimal points that maybe shouldn't quite be there, because these are really hard problems to measure. I do think we need to think about 2019 as the major checkpoint that was set, the first major checkpoint of presidents and prime ministers for the SDGs next September. That is a deadline for the intergovernmental process to think about what to do differently, but it's also a deadline for all the constituencies to think about what to do differently, because if there's one thing we know, it's that left to their own devices, these processes might not generate anything new, but if people agree to take these policy moments seriously, it's a real chance to say, how could we bend those curves in the places where they're needed most? Thanks.
John, thank you very much. So you've laid out for us the scenario going forward.